This is something that you probably haven't heard about, as it's been part of a huge Canadian government cover-up for years. Although there are still a lot of unknowns, this is not a conspiracy. These are real events that happen to real people and can be verified. This is not something that the Canadian government wants people to know about. This is not something that is being taught in history class in school. This is something that I only stumbled upon coincidentally while I was a nursing student. Otherwise, I probably would have never known. My first patient in my nursing practicum was an elderly woman from Quebec who was labeled as having a variety of mental illnesses and exhibited signs of PTSD. Looking into her file, I found out she was a Duplessis orphan. When I uncovered what that meant, it made me sick, utterly revolted that this was allowed to happen at all, let alone happen in Canada. Named after the devout Catholic Marie Duplessis, who was the Premier of Quebec off and on between 1936 and 1959, the Duplessis Orphans were a huge group of around 300,000 children that were handed over to the Catholic Church and put into orphanages. In many cases, these children were not actually orphans, but were often born out of wedlock, and the Catholic Church would guilt the parents into giving up the children, saying that they would be able to care for them better. Because the Catholic Church got more government funding if the children were mentally ill, they lied, and many of the orphanages became psychiatric hospitals. This is where healthy children were given the labels of having psychiatric disorders, so that way they could quadruple the amount that they received per child. Disgusting. And this is where it really gets messed up. Survivors of this claim that they were used as child labor and tortured in various ways, including in the form of ice baths, straitjackets, electroshock therapy, sleep deprivation, being collared like dogs, lobotomies, experimental drugs, physical and sexual abuse, and basically being used as lab rats at the hands of sociopathic doctors. Pretty similar to the things that Nazis were doing to the prisoners at concentration camps during World War II, it's not surprising that some of the doctors of the Duplessis experiments had Nazi ties, including notorious Joseph Mengele, who was a Nazi doctor who was in charge of who was sent to the gas chambers, by the way. And the Catholic Church did not act alone on this. The Duplessis hospitals were also under the rule of the American Psychiatric Association. Some survivors' testimonies claim that the CIA may have been involved in some of the experiments, like MKUltra. Many of these children were sold to childless families or on the black market. So this was also an underground child trafficking medium that the government or governments, depending on how far down the rabbit hole this really goes, at least knew about if they weren't directly involved. And this is not the last time that there was a government child trafficking cover-up, Pizzagate. Of course, many of the children who were not sold died at the hands of these Catholic facilities from the torturous atrocities. The true proof of this barbarity is how the massive volume of the children's remains were handled. An unmarked mass grave was uncovered in 1999 with over 2,000 remains. It was called the pigsty because it happened to be located next to a giant pig farm owned by the nuns, which raised speculations of whether or not some of the bodies were being fed to pigs. When the Catholic Church sold this land, workers dug up human bones. This find was then covered up by the government, who now own that property, saying that the bones were that of animals. But the workers told the true story because it's hard to mistake a finger and arm and leg bones, which are clearly human. And a Canadian law that was passed in 1942 made it legal to sell the remains of the orphans to medical schools for $10 a body. We don't know how many cadavers were sold this way because hospital registries have mysteriously disappeared from government archives. How convenient. Many of the survivors still carry around false labels of mental illness on their medical files, and of course many have PTSD or a complete lack of education. Anytime that this has been brought up in the news, the government has tried to sweep it under the rug. Finally, in 2002, a group of 1,100 Duplessis orphans settled with the government for about $25 million. This is about $23,000 apiece, which is not enough for a ruined childhood, if you ask me, in return for them signing a contract stating that they would not sue the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has not apologized for this or even admits to it. My patient never received a dime in compensation for her years of torture, and it seems like this dark history is going to die with the remaining Duplessis orphan survivors, and it will be forgotten forever. What needs to happen, but probably won't, is more government recognition of this, because some of the politicians that were involved in this are still alive. So it will just be continued to be swept under the rug, so nobody has to atone for this. Along with the Canadian residential school system, which is a similar Canadian tragedy that deserves its own video, this needs to be put in Canadian history books in schools. You can't just whitewash history because it's shameful and you don't want to think about it. It happened, and you need to acknowledge that it happened. The Catholic Church needs to be accountable for these atrocities. An apology is the first step. We are still prosecuting Nazis. Why not people who tortured and killed thousands of children in Canada? I hope this has opened your eyes to the Canadian government cover-up that involved the death of hundreds of thousands of children. It's sick, it's disgusting, it seems like a sad movie, but it happened and it needs to be known. Please share this video with others so that way they know the truth of Duplessis Orphans, because we can't just forget about this. This happened, this needs to be acknowledged, and people need to know the truth. Thank you.